You know what I want to talk about that doesn't matter today? Have you ever noticed how black and white sci-fi is with its aliens? They either are like humans but add space and gobbledygook to the beginning of normal Earth things like space tequila, or they have zero concept of things that absolutely make sense and should be just translated to human language, like these strange screens they stare at, or those odd rubber dolls they do strange things to. Well, if you're like me, you've wondered how exactly real aliens would be like. I mean, it's very hard to tell, but when you go online, you're met by walls of people making up aliens to be spirituality and new age psychic shit instead of the probably biological organisms they would be. So today, let's answer that curiosity. What would aliens actually be like? And could we ever come to understand them? Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of WAYTAT. Welcome back to the update corner, or just the space right before the main episode if you're audio only. I have been seeing a steady increase in views and follows. I appreciate that deeply, and if you're new here, thank you so much. Please stick around and watch some more stuff, and also, watch things when they first come out. For some reason, old episodes and videos keep getting watched and played, and I don't know why. But anyways, make sure to like, comment, subscribe, follow, ring the bell, download, jork to my voice, tell people about the show, laugh at my dumb jokes on Twitter I occasionally make, and try to find out where else you could possibly find me. Please. But don't actually worry about half of that. Honestly, if you watch the video or listen in 1x speed, do some downloads, likes, and tell people, I'm happy. You're awesome. Speaking of awesome people, also make sure to support my friends. Follow Winkashka on Twitch, YouTube, Blue Sky, and everywhere else. They're going to be back to streaming soon, just recovering from some personal medical stuff. Don't worry, guys, they're okay. But if you go over there, make sure you're fucking nice. Also, check out Mystic Luna for their craft goods and visit their Shopify. They'll be doing shows all around the Pacific Northwest if you want to buy in person. Again, be fucking nice. And follow Captain Cupcakes on Instagram, TikTok, and everywhere else I remember to link below. And with that, let's get on to the show. So this topic sounds like it's going to be a massive pain in the ass, but luckily, cultural development is one of my many hyperfixations, so I know some ways around it. And also that, cultural development is not nearly as complicated as you might think. Complex, yes, not complicated. Now, in order to create an alien culture, we need to have a sentient alien. So, how do you get one of those? Well, as Biblaridian has said in his excellent video series on aliens, which you should watch, by the way, there's a difference between obligate and effective sentience. Now, for creatures that are building civilization, you'll want what we're having, which is obligate sentience. And this is when an organism's survivability relies purely on sentience rather than it being a survival tool. Animals on Earth, like whales, octopi, dolphins, crows, orangutans, chimps, and others, are all sentient as we've been discovering more and more. Their levels of cognition and emotional regulation and self-awareness are similar to ours. But know why they aren't developing civilizations? Because they have other tools for their survival besides their sentience. We don't really have any. We're not stronger, faster, tougher, parasite-resistant, or more weather-resistant than other animals. But we're still the top dogs in our world. So any species needs to be in a comparable position, and how does sentience evolve in these creatures in the first place? Well, they need to have a need for tool use, cooperation, prioritization, and task management, and an ability and need to constantly learn things. It's also helpful if they stick around their general parental groups for a long time. So, our aliens will need to follow the same general path. Cooperative tool users that are the physically least impressive creatures on their world that need to know how to learn and prioritize and have a tendency to stick around their parents. But now, with that established, that any alien species will represent the weak little baby beta cucks of their planet, let's talk about the things that influence a creature's biology that'll impact their culture. Something that, almost as important as sentience, in my opinion, is the state of their planet. What I mean is that the reason why humans developed sentience in the first place is because of the climate of Earth. Earth, for a planet of our size, is extremely temperamental and hostile. And why is that? Well, in large part because of our weather, which, in some respects, is heavily affected by our moon. It's fucking massive for the size of our planet, which causes a pretty significant effect on our tides and weather, which in turn causes creatures to be more competitive because of how often climate changes, and tougher because of the unpredictable nature of natural disasters, weather systems, and harsh climates that occur. Not to mention the effect that the moon has on our cultures, because it's very big in the sky and allows for more nighttime activities than would otherwise be available to us. Other things like having many islands, being mostly or having very little oceans, having highly active suns, having more or less lunar mass, other planets, and the night sky itself, all affect how life develops and will then affect our aliens. But okay, that's all still pretty vague, right? I mean, all that we know about what an alien culture would be like is that they're the same level of cock as humans, and their planet shapes their development. Who cares? How does that help? Well, we gotta establish this stuff early because it lets us start to understand a very important thing. That as special as Earth is, there's certain factors that are universal across all civilizations, human or otherwise. Their environment and history massively shapes it, and at the core of it, we all have sentience. Now, how we express that might be different, but if you're able to communicate with an alien that has a general understanding of physics and the planetary sciences, they'd understand what, say, a desert is. Because even if they don't have them on their world, physics presumably works the same everywhere in the universe, meaning, assuming their planet isn't made of something fucking ridiculous, their planet operates on similar principles ours does, and reacts to stimuli in a way that we can grasp and understand. But to get more detail, we should look into their diet, habits, and senses. Diet is important in how a culture develops, because it really determines the origins and structures of civilization. Humans, for example, developed as omnivores, primarily eating roots, fruit, scientific fruit, not culinary fruit, and small animals. So we didn't have any capacity to consume a very large prey item all at once. Not until we developed tools, large-scale cooperation, and sentience. With that, we were able to hunt the big stuff. Which meant to make that last, we had to develop salting, curing, smoking, drying, and cooking. And these larger creatures gave better tools for our survival. And because we were slowing down to do these things, it became more and more common to settle in a general localized area, which lets us cultivating knowledge about specific plants and animals, eventually domesticating them. And this has a pretty profound effect on the human mind and monoculture, like pointing arrows, for example. This originates deep within the human psyche back from the time of the ancient past, when we used the business end of a spear to point at something, given it was a pretty convenient way to do that. And this came from us hunting, so you have to ask, would an herbivorous or even chemotrophic alien have an understanding of what exactly that symbol is or means? Or what about human phrases that are the rough equivalent of the English phrases sowing seeds or putting down roots? Would a carnivore understand innately where those come from or what they really mean, or would they need to really think about it? And this also affects the history of settlement, Like I mentioned earlier, for humans, land was being claimed for agriculture, which couldn't be taken with you if you had to run away from a threat, which created defenses and fortifications, warriors, attitudes of fight over flight, and eventually borders and the concept of land ownership. Would that happen for a species that developed from herding only? Now, we also have the habits or behaviors, especially something like movement. Using humans as an example again, much of the reason why we're able to hunt more effectively in the first place is our arms. We developed from arboreal apes, so we have very accurate, well-controlled, and flexible shoulder joints, which allows us to throw with incredible accuracy and power, and led us directly to ranged weapons. That, combined with how dexterous our hands are, made our arms more effective in tools by letting us swing wide over our head and coming down with incredible precision. And as we developed stronger, more dexterous, detail-oriented arms, we could do it better and better and get modern levels of hand-eye coordination. But what about with species with different movement habits, or different behavior habits? Like in Billuridian's series finale, the sentient species came from burrowers, meaning they developed stronger chopping and hacking melee early on. They couldn't throw for very far or very hard, but they can accurately thrust their arms downward, which influences their hunting and settling habits. Same with mating, social, work, and behavior habits. All this influences how they settle and become civilizations, villages, and cities. And then we have senses. How powerful the senses are and what they are affects what a creature perceives reality as, which is a big deal with culture. For humans, our order of sensory power is sight, hearing, touch, smell, and then taste. And the exact way we use these senses and their ranges of sensitivity is a cornerstone of all human expression, like our facial movements being largely dependent on sight, our tone of voice being very important, humans craving human touch and intimacy, and our nimble, highly sensitive fingers allow for non-visual touch communication like braille and textured grips or other forms of warning. These things collectively affect how we organize socially and our collective symbolism. Music, color symbolism, drawing, visual art, writing, and visual runes are all what we consider clear representations of culture and mass communication. Many disability aids to help people that are publicly available and built into our infrastructure are about movement accessibility, but also making up for lack of sight or hearing, which should tell you what you need to know about human communication. But what about a species whose strongest senses were taste, smell, and then sight? Then you'd see a species where taste and sense symbolism and indicators would rule public spaces, sight being a warning signal to those who can't taste or smell, and those would be the people equivalent to being blind or deaf. This would be a world not built for humans in any way. Or what if a species had sight as their primary sense, but was orange tinted? Then their understanding of blue and purple wouldn't be nearly as distinguishable as ours is, but their range of orange, yellow, and red would be more striking. And they would then have more names for these colors and more symbolism to them, and they would represent a broader range of things. And with all of these put together, you can get a very good sense about how alien biology and our own would interact on a cultural level. Things like their values, norms, customs, communication, symbolism, politics, economy, education, faith, art, technology, and ways of making war are all heavily slanted by these things. But any alien species with the technological level we have or beyond would be more than capable of understanding our version of their things and vice versa. Like, aliens would understand television if they had similar enough social dynamics and methodologies of information distribution, which means they'd understand YouTube, live streaming, and video chats. And probably wouldn't say something like, these strange things you call television, unless they were being intentionally dismissive or just fucking stupid. A screen emitting light and sound for the purposes of information and entertainment is not a strange concept to a species capable of detecting light and sound that can both get bored and need to share things in mass. But, okay, In case this isn't fully crystallized for you, or want to see an example, let's talk about some alien culture possibilities. The first, we'll call them the cephalids, are a semi-aquatic species that looks like a cephalopod, just with very thick tentacles and leathery skin to protect them from the outside elements. Now, in the history of their species, they became obligately sentient because while they're clever, dexterous, flexible, and able to shift skin pigment and texture, the vast majority of the animals around where they live are aquatic super predators, meaning that they were forced closer and closer to shorelines to avoid them and are now outside of their niche. So, they're much weaker, slower, and less adapted to their environment than most other animals of their world. Meaning, they had to rely more and more on their tools and sentience, and then they became obligately sentient. And their world, let's say, is mostly aquatic, with atolls, islands, and small continents, but about 91% of the total surface is ocean. Hence why most things are aquatic or semi-aquatic. They have a relatively small moon for their planet too, and this would mean that their planet is humid, warm, and rainy all over the place, and is covered in a constantly swirling group of tropical storms that travel along the trade winds. Which is scary. These things combined means that they would have to have remembered routes of wind and location of safe havens, which would push them further into obligate sentience. Cephalids also live on a steady diet of anything they can find. They're omnivores, but because of their beaks, they can consume a lot harder materials and break into much harder shells. And, let's also say that they have like a toughened foregut. Let's also say they have like a toughened foregut that collects like the shards of stuff that they end up swallowing so that, they don't hurt themselves. But being coastal, having a lot of deep water enemies that actually eat a lot of reef fish and plants, coastal plants and animals, and things like shellfish. And because of how oceans generally develop, meat is more often a food source than plants. However, given their tentacles, throwing wouldn't really be an option, so spear hunting and fishing wouldn't be either. However, they can swim very, very well and might even be able to lob things pretty effectively. But this might also be where they develop to live semi-aquatically, because they would need to be in water to reproduce, but instead of how humans reproduce, let's say that they spawn reproduce. So some of their island alcoves might have started as nurseries and turn into fully fledged settlements meant to protect their children, probably making them just as, if not more, territorial than humans, especially considering the rarity of land. Also, given mostly being aquatic, their sense of hearing would likely be at a lower frequency and more accustomed to water, meaning they can hear much faster and for a longer distance, but fail basically instantly on land, making them mostly deaf out of the water. While their eyesight would be almost 360 degrees, their color detection would be lower and blue shifted, but their ability to detect reflection, texture, clarity, and polarized light give them decent eyesight. They also generally have a sense of smell, but not well developed. But their taste and touch senses would be heavily intertwined and function almost at the same time. They'd have excellent senses of taste and touch, meaning that the ways that they interact with the world would be primarily touch, then taste, and then tertiarily sight. Now, imagine what kind of cultures you can build out of that, or what cultures you can imagine out of that. Things that are exceptionally different from humans, but things that feel familiar, even if you're going out of your way to ignore things that are human oriented, like taking inspiration from real life cultures. I mean, just taking their settlements for example, a lot of their settlements would be associated with childhood, home, growing up, rather than ownership, territory, property, like it is for humans. Similarly, I can imagine that they would have a lot of folklore about how terrifying the deep ocean is. That they would probably worship the weather early on, and that later on, as they developed, the weather would still be a key component to whatever belief system that they have. Things like that. It's stuff that is understandable to us as humans, but is entirely different from us. Our other species we'll call the Snarids is a very large carnivorous humanoid alien. Their species history comes from pack hunting predators that began to walk upright specifically to help in climbing trees. They became obligately sentient because of a changing climate. As their region became less and less full of trees, and the animals evolved to be bigger and bigger, they had to rely more on standing on two legs and using tools in order to survive. They were already sentient, as most of the animals on their planet require expert teamwork in order to take on, but with those animals becoming more dangerous, they had to alter their hunting until they were reliant on it. Their world is similar to the conditions of the Earth, but a bit more turbulent with the weather and climate, largely because of the effects of their very large moon and strangely active sun that releases solar flares far more often than a star its size should, making its life highly resilient but also damaging long-term stability, making for general climate catalogs for areas rather than a single reliable climate. Due to being carnivores, these aliens would likely not settle very quickly, since their hunting habits would probably turn into herding rather than planting, meaning they would be nomadic for a longer period of time than humans would. But given the danger of their world, most likely these settlements would have been established still fairly early on to protect their herds, with their herds on the inside and them on the outside. So settlements would be associated with animals. And this again would affect why they settle and associations of home. For humans, home and territory is associated with fields, agriculture, growing food, living space. For these spaces, for this species, home and territory is more associated with herds, wealth, animals, basically animal pens, ranching, than from an early time compared to us. Now, biologically, they're going to be quite tall and stocky, but have some biological markers similar to canines and serpents. Similar to canines is their social structure of families, but in markers similar, but in a much larger clan structure, i.e., two parents and their children make up nuclear packs that hunt together and own herds, and large groups of these interrelated families make up settlements and clans. Basically, when the child gets old enough and they want to split off into their own hunting pack, they form a hunting pack, and then that is part of the same clan. We'll also say that they have plantigrade legs, but have very long limbs in comparison to their body size, similar to canine jaw structures, and blunt, non-retractable claws for traction and digging into the trees. However, much like the serpents that they are similar to, they'll also have scales, be cold-blooded, have slow metabolic rates, molt to avoid parasites and surface damage, and have a hypermobile jaw structure to help them capture prey more effectively. Combined, their hunting method is pack ambush, using members to climb trees and force prey onto the ground to be pounced on, killed, and slaughtered. With these habits and biological features, they may not develop the ability to throw quite like humans, but could develop a sort of shot put motion and maneuver to use powerful bows early during their history, or shot put stones accurately. Their habits would also make their early warfare and longer term strategy against aggressors much more built around ambush, patience, and accounting for their long periods of inactivity. In fact, much of their culture would be built around long periods of inactivity. Now, with their senses being similar to serpents and canines, their sensory palette would be something like smell, hearing, taste, sight, and then finally touch. This does mean that their sense of smell and hearing would be wildly powerful. That makes sense, since to hunt their prey, they'd use their long snouts as a large scent capturing apparatus, while their hearing could be funneled through head shape and powerfully built organs in the inner ear. Both will be used to detect unseen prey that's above and avoid arboreal predators in the environments that they involved in, which would also happen to help them out on the wide open plains that are quickly developing around them. Their sense of taste would be their sense of taste being so strong would come from their tongues, which, like serpents, would have specialized structures meant to taste heat and certain chemical signatures that may be harmful to breathe in but not to taste. Things like hydrocarbons, formaldehyde, asbestos, and ammonium compounds. Often these are things associated with rot, uh, undergrowth, things that are stagnant. Their sense of sight, meanwhile, lags behind. Because, sure, having good eyesight would be nice for hunting in the trees, but they can get a good sense of the world without their sight. Uh, and sight would probably only really be there to reinforce their other senses. Therefore, their sense of sight might be blurry, but be very good in dim conditions with a lot of close and distant, still or slightly swaying terrain, so it'd probably have a lot more focus on motion over detail, and their forward-facing eyes for depth perception. And look, since we're being a little lazy, their eyesight would also have a harder time differentiating between green-red, so they would have more of a focus on gray, black, blue, and yellow. And because of their scales, they wouldn't really have much of a sense of touch. And again, we have a species that is very clearly very different from humans, but it's grounded, it's understandable. And I think this is, again, how an alien culture would develop, because it's how we developed. And that might sound human-centric, but it makes sense. There has to be certain universal things across the universe, and if we take away all the cultural aspects of everything and just look at what biological factors cause what things to happen, what psychological factors cause what things to happen, then we can come to this conclusion that a lot of our culture is built around our environment and our physiology. And with that, you can imagine what an alien would look like. And from that, how it would behave. And from that, how its civilization would look. And in a way that isn't human-centric or human-reliant. Of course, sure, aliens could be fifth-dimensional beings that operate out of the time sequence and are unable to be detected. But personally, I find that to be both boring and limited. It's just repackaging ancient belief in the spirits in a very human-centric way. I think it's much more likely that if aliens exist, they exist in similar parameters to us, because we have evidence of life evolving, not just on our world, but on other worlds. And it would be incredibly strange to assume the physics we observe don't apply everywhere else, too. But anyways, thank you so much for watching and listening. If you have opinions, improvements, corrections, and anything else you want to talk about, comment below or email me at waytatpods@gmail.com. That is WAYTATPODS@gmail.com. And remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. And follow my podcast feed for audio versions, and come back next time when we talk about superpowers again. Have a good night. Don't murder. Have fun. And remember, just because they're different from you doesn't mean they're also not cucks. This has been Why Aren't You Talking About This? And I've been your host, William. Good night.